The executive branch of the federal government is responsible for carrying out the functions of government on a day-to-day basis, of giving real-world impact to the laws passed by Congress. This lecture file examines how the bureaucracy is structured to carry out the functions of the federal government. There are a few different organizational categories within the federal bureaucracy. The first is what's known as the cabinet departments. These are the prestige departments that make up most of the executive branch. Each is headed by a secretary. For instance, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, etc. The one exception to this is the Justice Department. The leader of that bureaucracy is called the Attorney General, rather than the Secretary of Justice. Each year, the President proposes a budget for each cabinet department, and Congress ultimately appropriates a budget to each department. Each of these is staffed with thousands of civil servants, people who hold their jobs on the basis of technical skill and serve without fear of political recriminations. In other words, they can't be fired by the President. Each department is responsible for a particular policy area that it is supposed to be expert in. Cabinet secretaries and other top-level managers are political appointees, meaning they are selected by the President and confirmed by the Senate. This allows the President to influence the work of the Cabinet Department by appointing leaders to the bureaucracy who share the President's philosophy and priorities. But those top-down controls only go so far. The President and his political appointees can't violate existing laws that empower and require federal departments to carry out certain actions. They also can't fire career civil servants who are hired on the basis of merit. About 98% of the federal workforce is protected from that most potent of presidential management powers, the power to take away someone's job. That doesn't mean workers are immune from political influence from the top of the chain of the command, but it does mean that workers can, to at least some extent, resist the efforts of presidents and cabinet secretaries to dramatically change the nature of a department's mission and how it carries out that mission. A second type of federal bureaucracy are the independent executive agencies. These are similar to cabinet departments, but are generally somewhat narrower in scope. They're generally headed by someone called an administrator or director. Administrators, like cabinet secretaries, are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Some prominent examples of independent executive agencies include the Social Security Administration, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Small Business Administration, and NASA. Each of these agencies do very important work, but their missions are just more narrowly defined than the more sprawling cabinet departments. Independent regulatory agencies are quite distinct from cabinet departments or executive agencies. These agencies were created mostly during the 20th century as the federal government wrestled with its newly appointed task of managing a national industrial economy. Congress created a number of these agencies to be responsible for particular sectors of the economy, to make rules managing those sectors, and to adjudicate disputes to protect the public interest. These agencies essentially represent areas where Congress decided it was best to take certain decisions out of the realm of the elected branches and turn over decision-making to experts in certain fields. These agencies are meant to be independent from political pressure so that officials can make decisions solely on the basis of their technical judgment. Some examples include the Federal Reserve Board, which has a huge impact on the American economy by setting monetary policy, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is charged with regulating the stock market, the Federal Communications Commission, which sets important rules for the Internet, television, and radio, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is intended to protect consumers from abuses by financial institutions. Politics still plays a role in these agencies, as their leaders are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. But unlike with other bureaucracies, leaders of independent regulatory agencies serve set terms that tend not to overlap with presidential terms, so many leaders of these agencies are holdovers from a previous presidential administration. Also, once in office, Leaders of these agencies do not report to the president, and they cannot be fired by the president, allowing them to be much more independent than, say, cabinet secretaries can be. This can be frustrating to presidents who would like to have greater ability to exercise control over these agencies. For example, President Trump recently blamed a downturn in the stock market on decisions made by Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, to raise interest rates. Even though the president had just appointed Mr. Powell to the position in early 2018, there's really nothing the president can do to directly influence the decisions Mr. Powell makes now that he holds the office. The last type of federal bureaucracy are the government corporations. This is a relatively small number of federal organizations that carry out functions that sometimes compete with private sector enterprises. They're expected to pay their own way through fees charged to customers for their services, but sometimes they do require taxpayer support to balance their books. The main reason the federal government continues to operate a handful of corporations is to make sure that certain essential services are provided to citizens that might not be profitable for private businesses to serve. For example, the nation's oldest corporation, the Postal Service, guarantees mail service to anyone in the United States, regardless of how remote or difficult, and therefore unprofitable, their residential location might be.